The dust kicked up around Jake Morrison's boots as he rode into the small frontier town of Cedar Ridge. It was 1887, and the Arizona Territory was still wild and dangerous. Jake had been riding for 3 days straight, delivering cattle from his ranch to the railroad station. His horse was tired, and so was he. Jake was 28 years old, tall and lean from years of hard work on the range. His brown hair was always messy from wearing his hat, and his blue eyes had seen too much trouble for someone his age. He carried 2 Colt revolvers on his hip and knew how to use them well. Life on the frontier had taught him that a man needed to be ready for anything. As he rode down the main street, something felt wrong. The town was too quiet. Usually Cedar Ridge buzzed with activity during the day. Shopkeepers would be sweeping their porches, children would be playing in the street, and cowboys would be talking outside the saloon. But today the windows were shuttered and the streets were empty. Jake stopped his horse outside Murphy's General Store and dismounted. His spurs jingled as he walked up the wooden steps to the porch. He pushed open the door and a small bell rang overhead. Old Tom Murphy looked up from behind the counter, his face pale and worried. "Jake, thank God you're here," Tom whispered, looking around nervously. "You need to leave town right now." "It's not safe." Jake frowned and stepped closer to the counter. "What's going on, Tom? This place looks like a ghost town." Tom's hands shook as he wiped them on his apron. "There's someone here. Someone dangerous. They've been causing trouble for weeks now. People are scared to come outside." "Who is it?" Jake asked, his hand instinctively moving toward his gun. "Nobody knows for sure," Tom said quietly. "They wear a mask and Apache war paint. Some say it's a rogue warrior seeking revenge. Others think it's just a crazy person. But whoever it is, they're fast with a gun and mean as a rattlesnake." Jake had heard stories about Apache fighters. They were skilled warriors who knew the land better than anyone. If one had gone rogue and was terrorizing the town, it would explain why everyone was hiding. But something about Tom's story didn't add up. "Have they hurt anyone?" Jake asked. Tom shook his head. "That's the strange part. They could have killed plenty of folks, but they haven't. They just show up because a scene, maybe shoot some bottles off a fence, and then disappear. It's like they're playing some kind of game." Jake bought some supplies and asked Tom to care for his horse. He decided to stay in town for a few days. Something about this masked troublemaker interested him. In all his years on the frontier, he had never heard of an Apache warrior who fought just to scare people without actually hurting them. That evening, Jake sat on the porch of the town's only hotel, watching the sunset paint the sky orange and red. The street was still empty, but he could see faces peeking out from behind curtains. The whole town was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. As darkness fell, Jake heard the sound of horse hooves on the hard-packed dirt of the main street. He sat up straight and squinted into the shadows. A figure on horseback appeared at the far end of the street, moving slowly toward the center of town. Even in the dim light, Jake could see that the rider wore traditional Apache clothing and had war paint on their face. But there was something else, a strange mask that covered the upper part of their face. The mask looked like it was made of leather and decorated with feathers and beads. The mysterious rider stopped in the middle of the street and dismounted. They stood there for a moment, looking around as if challenging anyone to come out and face them. Jake felt his heart start to beat faster. This was his chance to solve the mystery that had been terrorizing Cedar Ridge. Jake stood up slowly and stepped off the porch into the street. His boots made soft sounds on the dirt as he walked toward the masked figure. The town seemed to hold its breath as the two faced each other in the growing darkness. "I hear you've been causing trouble in this town," Jake called out, his voice steady and calm. The masked figure turned toward him. Even though Jake couldn't see their eyes behind the mask, he could feel them studying him carefully. There was something about the way this person moved that seemed different from what he expected. It was graceful, almost like a dancer. "This town needs to remember that this land doesn't belong to them," the figure replied. The voice was muffled by the mask, making it hard for Jake to tell much about the speaker. Jake took another step forward. "Maybe we can talk about this without guns." The masked figure laughed, but it sounded strange. Not quite what Jake expected from an angry Apache warrior. "Talk. The time for talking ended long ago, cowboy." Without warning, the figure's hand moved toward their weapon. Jake's instincts kicked in and his own hand flew to his gun. In the frontier, the difference between life and death often came down to who could draw faster. The two guns cleared leather at almost the same instant. Jake's Colt was in his hand, aimed and ready, but he held his fire. The masked figure also had their weapon drawn, pointing it directly at Jake's chest. For a long moment, they stood like statues in the middle of the empty street, each waiting for the other to make a move. Jake had been in gunfights before, but this felt different. Usually, when men faced each other with weapons, there was anger in the air, hot and dangerous. But this felt more like a test, as if the masked figure was trying to prove something rather than kill him. "You're fast," the figure said, and Jake could hear a note of approval in the muffled voice. "Faster than the others who tried to face me." "Others?" Jake asked, keeping his gun steady. "How many have challenged you?" 3 men thought they could be heroes, the figure replied. All of them ended up on their backs in the dirt wondering what happened. But none of them were hurt badly. "I don't kill unless I have to." This confirmed what Tom Murphy had told him. Whoever this was, they weren't interested in murder. Jake made a decision that would have surprised anyone who knew him. Slowly, carefully, he lowered his gun and holstered it. "Then let's settle this a different way," Jake said. The masked figure tilted their head, clearly surprised by Jake's action. "You would trust me not to shoot you?" "If you wanted me dead, I'd already be dead," Jake replied. "You had a clear shot and you didn't take it. That tells me something about who you really are." For a moment, the figure seemed to consider this. Then with a fluid motion, they also holstered their weapon. "You're either very brave or very stupid, cowboy." "Probably a little of both," Jake admitted with a slight smile. "But I'd like to know why you're really here. This isn't about revenge or anger. You're trying to tell this town something." The masked figure was quiet for a long time. Jake could see them looking around at the shuttered windows and closed doors. When they spoke again, their voice was softer, less threatening. "This land belonged to my people for hundreds of years," they said. "Every rock, every tree, every stream has a story. But these settlers act like none of that matters. They take what they want and forget that others were here first." Jake nodded slowly. He had heard similar stories from other Apache people he had met during his years in the territory. The frontier was changing fast and not everyone was happy about it. "I understand your anger," Jake said. "But scaring innocent people won't change anything. If you want to make a real difference, there might be better ways." The figure stepped closer and Jake could see more details of their appearance. The Apache clothing was authentic and well made. The war paint was applied with skill and tradition. But something about the person wearing it still seemed off to Jake, though he couldn't put his finger on what it was. "You speak differently than most cowboys," the figure observed. "Most of them would have started shooting by now." "I've learned that fighting isn't always the answer," Jake replied. "Sometimes understanding works better." They talked for nearly an hour in the middle of that empty street. The masked figure told Jake about sacred places that had been destroyed by mining and ranching. They spoke about streams that had been polluted and mountains that had been scarred by dynamite. Jake listened carefully and he began to understand why someone might feel driven to take dramatic action. But as they talked, Jake noticed other things too. The way the figure moved was graceful and careful. Their hands were smaller than he would have expected from a warrior. Even their voice, though disguised by the mask, had qualities that made him curious. "Will you meet me again tomorrow night?" the figure asked as their conversation began to wind down. "There are things I could show you. Places where you could see what I'm talking about." Jake agreed. He was genuinely interested in learning more, both about the land and about this mysterious person who seemed to care so deeply about it. The figure mounted their horse and prepared to leave. But before riding away, they turned back to Jake one more time. "You're different from what I expected, cowboy. Most men like you only care about cattle and money." "My name is Jake Morrison," he said. "And you're right. A lot of cowboys only think about profit. But some of us care about doing what's right." "Jake Morrison," the figure repeated as if testing how the name sounded. "Tomorrow night, then. Meet me at the old oak tree by the creek just outside of town. Come alone." As the figure rode away into the darkness, Jake stood in the street thinking about their conversation. He was more curious than ever about who was behind that mask. There had been something familiar about the way they spoke, something that reminded him of someone, though he couldn't remember who. The next day, word spread quickly through Cedar Ridge that Jake Morrison had faced the masked troublemaker and lived to tell about it. People began to come out of their houses again, though they still looked nervous. Some of the braver townspeople approached Jake to ask what had happened. Jake told them that he had talked with the person, but he didn't share the details of their conversation. Something told him that the masked figure's trust was important, and he didn't want to betray it by gossiping with the townspeople. As evening approached, Jake prepared to ride out to the meeting place. He checked his guns and saddled a fresh horse, but deep down he didn't expect trouble. His instincts told him that despite the dramatic appearance, the masked figure was not truly dangerous, at least not to him. The old oak tree stood like a giant sentinel beside the creek, its massive branches reaching toward the star-filled sky. Jake arrived just as the sun disappeared behind the distant mountains, painting the landscape in shades of purple and gold. The sound of water flowing over rocks was peaceful and soothing after the tension of the past few days. Jake dismounted and tied his horse to a smaller tree nearby. He didn't have to wait long before he heard the soft sound of approaching hoofbeats. The masked figure emerged from the shadows, moving as quietly as smoke across the ground. "You came," the figure said, and Jake thought he heard a note of surprise in their voice. "I said I would," Jake replied. "I'm a man of my word." The figure dismounted and walked over to where Jake stood. In the moonlight, Jake could see more details of their appearance. The Apache clothing was not just authentic, it was beautiful. The leather was soft and decorated with intricate beadwork. The mask itself was a work of art, carved from dark wood and adorned with eagle feathers and small pieces of turquoise. "Follow me," the figure said. "There's something I want you to see." They walked together along the creek for about half a mile, leading their horses behind them. The masked figure moved with the confidence of someone who knew every rock and tree in the area. Jake found himself impressed by their knowledge of the land. "Here," the figure said, stopping beside a small clearing. "This was once a sacred place for my people. Women would come here to give birth, and children would have their naming ceremonies under these stars." Jake looked around the clearing. It was beautiful and peaceful, but he could see signs that it had been disturbed. There were deep ruts from wagon wheels and piles of trash left by careless travelers. "Now it's just a place where cowboys camp when they're driving cattle to market," the figure continued, sadness clear in their voice. "They don't know what it meant to the people who were here before them." Jake felt a genuine sadness as he looked at the sacred place that had been treated so carelessly. He had grown up respecting the land, and it bothered him to see it abused. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "This should have been protected." The figure turned to look at him, and Jake caught a glimpse of eyes behind the mask. They were dark and expressive, filled with pain but also with something that looked like hope. They continued walking, and the figure showed Jake other places that held special meaning. There was a spring where Apache families had come for water during dry seasons, now polluted by mining runoff. There was a hill where young warriors had gone to seek visions, now scarred by dynamite from a failed mining operation. Each place told a story of loss and disrespect. Jake began to understand why someone would feel driven to take dramatic action to get people's attention. The figure wasn't just causing trouble for fun. They were trying to wake people up to what was being lost. "Why did you choose to do this alone?" Jake asked as they sat by the spring, listening to the water trickle over the rocks. "Surely there are others who feel the same way you do." The figure was quiet for a long time before answering. "Sometimes one person has to stand up and make noise before others will pay attention. And sometimes the person who cares the most is the one who has the least power to change things through normal means." Jake thought about this answer. It sounded like the words of someone who had tried other approaches and failed. Someone who felt they had no choice but to resort to dramatic gestures. "What's your real name?" Jake asked gently. "I've told you mine," the figure hesitated. "Names have power," they said finally. "When you know someone's name, you can control them or hurt them. It's safer to remain hidden." "I'm not going to hurt you," Jake said, "and I'm certainly not going to try to control you. You've trusted me this much already." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the night sounds around them. An owl called from somewhere in the darkness, and small animals rustled in the brush nearby. Jake found himself feeling more peaceful than he had in months. "There's something else I want to show you," the figure said eventually, "but it's further away. We'll need to ride." They mounted their horses and rode for another hour, climbing into the foothills of the mountains. The moon was bright enough to light their way, and both horses seemed sure-footed on the rocky trail. Jake was impressed again by how well the figure knew the country. Finally, they stopped at the edge of a cliff that overlooked a wide valley. In the moonlight, Jake could see a beautiful landscape spread out below them. Grasslands dotted with trees, a river winding through the middle, and mountains rising on all sides. This is how it all looked before the changes came, the figure said softly. Can you imagine herds of buffalo moving across those grasslands? Can you see the smoke from Apache camps rising from beside the river? Jake could imagine it, and the vision was beautiful. He understood now why the figure felt so strongly about protecting this land. It wasn't just dirt and rocks, it was a living piece of history. It's magnificent, Jake said honestly. I can see why you want to preserve it. The figure turned toward him, and in the moonlight Jake caught another glimpse of their eyes. There was something familiar about them, something that nagged at the back of his mind. He felt like he should recognize this person, but he couldn't quite place the feeling. You really mean that, don't you? The figure asked. You're not just saying what you think I want to hear. I never lie, Jake said simply. Life's too short for dishonesty. They rode back toward town in comfortable silence, both lost in their own thoughts. Jake found himself thinking about the places he had been shown and the stories he had heard. The masked figure had opened his eyes to things he had never considered before. As they reached the outskirts of Cedar Ridge, the figure spoke again. Will you meet me tomorrow night? There's one more place I'd like you to see. Jake agreed without hesitation. He was learning things that mattered, and he was beginning to care about this mysterious person who trusted him enough to share their secrets. Jake spent the next day in town, but his mind kept wandering back to his conversations with the masked figure. Something about their last meeting had left him with more questions than answers. The familiarity he felt when looking into those eyes behind the mask was growing stronger, like a word on the tip of his tongue that he couldn't quite remember. He walked around Cedar Ridge, talking to the townspeople and observing things he had never really noticed before. Tom Murphy mentioned that his grandfather had told him stories about Apache families who used to trade peacefully with the first white settlers. Mrs. Henderson, who ran the boarding house, showed him some beautiful beadwork she had bought from Apache women years ago. Before tensions made such trades impossible, the more Jake learned, the more he understood the masked figure's frustration. There had been a time when different peoples had lived together on this land with mutual respect. That time seemed to be ending, and someone was trying desperately to remind people of what was being lost. As evening approached, Jake prepared for another meeting. This time the figure had asked him to meet at an even more remote location, an ancient Pueblo ruin high in the mountains. It would be a difficult ride in the dark, but Jake was curious about what he would be shown. The ride took nearly 2 hours, following narrow trails that wound up steep mountainsides. Jake's horse picked its way carefully over loose rocks and around fallen trees. The masked figure led the way with the confidence of someone who had made this journey many times before. Finally, they reached a flat area where the ruins stood silhouetted against the star-filled sky. Even in the moonlight, Jake could see that this had once been an impressive settlement. Stone buildings rose several stories high, and intricate walls showed the skill of the people who had built them long ago. This place is over 500 years old, the figure said as they walked among the ruins. The people who built it understood how to live with the land instead of fighting against it. They took only what they needed and gave back more than they took. Jake ran his hands over the smooth stone walls, marveling at the craftsmanship. These weren't the crude dwellings he might have expected, but sophisticated buildings designed by people who understood both engineering and beauty. Why did they leave? Jake asked. Nobody knows for sure, the figure replied. Some say it was drought. Others believe it was war. But the important thing is what they left behind. Proof that people can live here without destroying everything around them. They explored the ruins for over an hour, with the figure explaining what different buildings had been used for. There had been homes, workshops, storage areas, and places for ceremonies. It had been a complete community where people lived, worked, and raised families. As they sat on a stone wall overlooking the valley below, Jake felt a strange sensation. The place seemed alive somehow, as if the spirits of the people who had once lived here were still present. It wasn't frightening, more like being welcomed by friendly ghosts. I come here when I need to remember why I'm fighting, the figure said quietly. This place reminds me that there are ways of living that we've forgotten, ways that might be better than what we're doing now. Jake nodded, understanding completely. It makes our problems seem small, doesn't it? These people dealt with challenges we can't even imagine, and they created something beautiful. The figure turned toward him, and once again, Jake caught that glimpse of familiar eyes. This time the feeling was so strong that he almost spoke up. But something held him back. Perhaps respect for the person's desire to remain hidden, or perhaps fear that pressing the issue might break the trust they had built. "You're different from other cowboys I've known," the figure said. "Most of them only care about moving cattle and making money. They don't have time for old stories or sacred places." "Maybe you haven't known the right cowboys," Jake replied with a smile. "Some of us care about more than just profit." They talked until nearly dawn, sharing stories about their lives and their hopes for the future. The masked figure spoke about dreams of finding ways for different peoples to live together peacefully. Jake talked about his own desire to ranch in a way that respected the land rather than just using it up. As the sky began to lighten in the east, they prepared to head back to town. But as they walked toward their horses, the figure stumbled on a loose stone and fell hard against one of the pueblo walls. Jake rushed over to help, and as he did, he noticed that the figure's mask had shifted slightly in the fall. For just a moment, he could see more of their face than ever before. What he saw made his heart skip a beat. The jawline was too delicate for a man. The neck was graceful and slender, and when the figure spoke, saying they were all right, Jake heard something in the voice that the mask couldn't completely hide. Everything suddenly made sense. The graceful movements, the smaller hands, the way the person sat on their horse, even the passion in their voice when speaking about protecting the land. The masked Apache fighter who had been terrorizing Cedar Ridge was a woman. Jake helped her to her feet, being careful not to let on that he had discovered her secret. His mind was racing with questions, but he knew this wasn't the time or place to ask them. The trust she had shown him was precious, and he wouldn't betray it by forcing a revelation she wasn't ready to make. "Are you hurt?" he asked, keeping his voice casual and concerned. "Just bruised," she replied, adjusting her mask carefully. "These old ruins can be treacherous in the dark." They rode back toward town in silence, but Jake's mind was spinning with this new knowledge. Who was she? Why was she doing this alone? And most importantly, why did he feel like he should know her? As they parted ways on the outskirts of Cedar Ridge, she turned to him one more time. "Tomorrow night, if you're willing, I'd like to show you one final place." "It's the most important one of all," Jake agreed, knowing that tomorrow night might bring answers to all the questions that were now burning in his mind, but he also knew that whatever those answers were, they would change everything. Jake couldn't concentrate on anything the next day. The knowledge that the mysterious Apache fighter was a woman had turned all his assumptions upside down. He found himself remembering every detail of their conversations, looking for clues he might have missed about her identity. The feeling that he should know her was growing stronger by the hour. There was something about her voice, her way of moving, even her passion for the land that seemed familiar, but try as he might, he couldn't place where he might have met her before. He spent the afternoon sitting on the hotel porch, watching the townspeople go about their business. Cedar Ridge was returning to normal now that people believed the threat was over. Children played in the street again, and the shops stayed open past sunset. But Jake knew the truth. The masked figure was still out there, and tonight would bring another meeting. As evening approached, Jake felt nervous in a way he hadn't experienced before. It wasn't fear of danger. He was convinced that the woman meant him no harm. Instead, it was the nervousness of knowing that tonight might bring revelations that would change everything. The meeting place, this time, was closer to town, a small canyon where a stream had carved its way through red sandstone cliffs. Jake arrived early and waited by the water, listening to the gentle sound of the current flowing over smooth rocks. When she appeared, Jake noticed immediately that something was different. She seemed less confident than before, almost hesitant. Her movements were still graceful, but there was a tension in her posture that hadn't been there during their previous meetings. "This is the last place I wanted to show you," she said, without her usual greeting. Her voice was softer than before, and Jake thought he detected a note of sadness in it. She led him along the stream to a place where the canyon opened into a small valley. In the center of the valley was a simple wooden cabin, obviously abandoned for some time. Wildflowers grew around it and vines had begun to climb the walls, but it was still in good condition. "This was my home," she said quietly. "I lived here with my family until 3 years ago." Jake felt his heart start to beat faster. This was the first truly personal thing she had shared with him, and he sensed that she was finally ready to tell him her story. "What happened?" he asked gently. She walked over to the cabin and placed her hand on the wooden door. "My father was Apache, but my mother was white, a school teacher who came west to educate the children of settlers. They fell in love and decided to build a life together here, away from people who might not understand their choice. Jake listened carefully, beginning to understand the complexity of her situation. In the Arizona Territory of the 1880s, marriages between Apache and white people were rare and often dangerous for both sides. They raised me to understand both worlds, she continued. I learned Apache traditions from my father's people, but I also learned to read and write from my mother. I thought I could live in both worlds, but I was wrong. She opened the cabin door and stepped inside. Jake followed, seeing the remnants of a life that had been interrupted suddenly. There were books on shelves, cooking pots on the stove, and children's drawings pinned to the walls. Everything was covered with dust, but it was clear that this had once been a happy home. 3 years ago, tensions between the Apache and the settlers reached a breaking point, she said, picking up one of the books and brushing off the dust. Some young Apache warriors attacked a ranch, and the territorial government decided to move all Apache people to a reservation far from here. Jake nodded, remembering the forced relocations that had happened during that time. It had been a difficult period for everyone involved. My father's people had to leave, but my mother and I couldn't go with them because we weren't considered Apache enough for the reservation, she continued. At the same time, we weren't accepted by the white community because of our Apache connections. We were caught between two worlds belonging to neither. Jake was beginning to understand the pain that had driven her to take such dramatic action. She had lost not just her home, but her entire identity and community. Where did you go? He asked. My mother got sick that winter, she said, her voice breaking slightly. Without my father's people to help us and with no welcome from the white community, we had nowhere to turn. She died alone in a cold room in Tucson, and I couldn't even afford a proper burial. Jake felt a deep sadness for this woman who had lost everything. No wonder she felt driven to fight for the land and the memory of her people. After that, I came back here, she said, gesturing around the abandoned cabin. I decided that if no one would listen to reasonable voices, maybe they would pay attention to someone who refused to be ignored. She walked over to a trunk in the corner and opened it. Inside, Jake could see Apache clothing, weapons, and what looked like family photographs. She pulled out a small picture and handed it to him. This is my family, she said, the only picture we ever had taken together. Jake looked at the photograph and his breath caught in his throat. The man in the picture was clearly Apache, tall and dignified. The woman beside him was white with kind eyes and a gentle smile. And between them stood a young girl with dark hair and eyes that Jake now recognized completely. Maria, he whispered, looking up from the photograph. Maria Reyes. She froze, her hand halfway to the mask that covered her face. For a long moment, neither of them moved or spoke. You remember me, she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Jake's mind was flooded with memories. Maria Reyes had been the daughter of the couple who ran a small trading post outside of Phoenix. He had met her several times during cattle drives when he would stop to buy supplies. She had been educated, intelligent, and passionate about justice even then. They had talked about books, about the changing West, and about the need for people to treat each other with respect, regardless of their backgrounds. I wondered what had happened to you, Jake said. When your family's trading post closed, I thought you had moved back east to live with relatives. There were no relatives, Maria said sadly. Just us, trying to make a life between two worlds that didn't want us to exist. Jake understood now why she had seemed familiar from the very beginning. Even behind the mask and war paint, even disguised as an Apache warrior, she was still the same intelligent, passionate woman he had met years ago. The same woman he had thought about many times during his lonely nights on the range. The silence in the abandoned cabin stretched between them like a bridge that neither Jake nor Maria was sure they should cross. Jake held the family photograph in his hands, studying the faces of people who had tried to build a life between two worlds and paid a terrible price for their courage. I remember you talking about wanting to make the world more fair, Jake said softly. You said that someone needed to speak up for people who had no voice. Maria nodded, tears beginning to gather in her eyes behind the mask. I never thought it would be me. I thought I could do it through teaching, or writing, or finding some peaceful way to make people understand. But no one wanted to listen to a half-breed girl with big ideas. Jake carefully set the photograph back in the trunk and took a step toward her. So you decided to become someone they couldn't ignore. The Apache clothing belonged to my father, Maria explained. He taught me to shoot, to ride, to move quietly through the desert. I thought if I appeared as an Apache warrior, people might finally pay attention to what was being lost. Jake was amazed by her courage and resourcefulness. She had created an entire identity to fight for something she believed in, even though it meant putting herself in constant danger. But why terrorize the town? Jake asked. You could have hurt innocent people. Maria shook her head firmly. I was never going to hurt anyone. I just wanted to make noise, to make people think about things they preferred to ignore. Every time I appeared, I made sure no one was actually in danger. Jake thought back to the stories he had heard in town. It was true. Despite all the fear and excitement, no one had been seriously hurt. Maria had been incredibly careful to frighten people without actually harming them. It was working, Maria continued. People were starting to ask questions about Apache history, about what had happened to the families who used to live here. But then you showed up. And I ruined your plan, Jake said with a slight smile. No, Maria said, and for the first time since removing her mask, she smiled back. You made me remember that there might be other ways to fight. Ways that don't require me to hide behind a mask. Jake felt his heart skip a beat at that smile. It was the same warm, intelligent expression he remembered from their meetings years ago. But now it was tinged with sadness and hard-won wisdom. What will you do now? He asked. Maria was quiet for a long time, looking around the cabin that had once been her home. I don't know, she admitted. For 3 years, being the masked Apache fighter was all I had. It gave me purpose and a way to honor my father's memory. But I can't do it forever. Jake made a decision that surprised even him. Come with me, he said. Maria looked at him with confusion. What do you mean? I have a ranch about 50 miles north of here, Jake explained. It's not big, but it's in beautiful country near a river. I've been working it alone, but I could use help. More than that, I could use a partner who understands the land the way you do. Maria stared at him as if he had suggested something impossible. Jake, you don't understand what you're saying. I'm not acceptable to white society, and I'm not welcome in Apache communities anymore. I don't belong anywhere. You belong wherever you choose to make a home, Jake said firmly, and you'd be welcome on my ranch. More than welcome. You'd be needed. Maria walked over to the window and looked out at the valley where she had grown up. People would talk. They'd say terrible things about you for taking in someone like me. Let them talk, Jake replied. I've never cared much about gossip, and I'm not going to start now. Besides, they don't need to know your whole story. As far as anyone else is concerned, you're just Maria Reyes, a woman who knows ranching and needs a job. Maria turned back to face him, hope and fear warring in her expression. What about the Apache fighter? People will wonder what happened to the masked troublemaker. Jake smiled. The Apache fighter served their purpose. They made people think about things they had forgotten. Now maybe it's time for Maria Reyes to find a different way to make a difference. For a long moment, Maria didn't speak. Jake could see her considering his offer, weighing the risks against the possibility of finally having a place where she could belong. Your ranch, she said finally. Is it near any of the places we visited? Any of the sacred sites? Jake nodded. It borders some of the most beautiful Apache country in the territory. There are streams your father's people considered sacred, and hills where the old ceremonies used to take place. I've always tried to respect those places, but I don't know all their stories. I could teach you, Maria said quietly. I could help you understand how to care for the land the way my father's people did. And I could help you build a new life, Jake replied. One where you don't have to hide behind a mask to be heard. Maria walked back to the trunk and carefully picked up the Apache clothing and weapons that had belonged to her father. These were meant to honor his memory, she said. But maybe the best way to honor him is to find a way to live peacefully on the land he loved. Jake watched as she folded the clothing with reverence and care. Does that mean you'll come with me? Maria looked at him for a long moment, then slowly reached up and removed the wooden mask that had hidden her identity for so long. In the moonlight streaming through the cabin window, Jake could see her face clearly for the first time since their reunion. She was even more beautiful than he remembered, but her eyes held depths of sorrow and strength that hadn't been there in their youth. Yes, she said simply. I'll come with you. Jake felt a surge of joy and relief. We can leave whenever you're ready. Tonight, if you want. Maria shook her head. There's one more thing I need to do first. Tomorrow morning, I want to ride into Cedar Ridge without the mask. I want to let people see who the Apache fighter really was. They deserve to know the truth. Jake felt a moment of concern. Are you sure that's wise? Some people might be angry when they realize they were frightened by a woman. Maybe, Maria agreed.
But I'm tired of hiding.
And if I'm going to start a new life, I want to begin it honestly. Jake admired her courage. It would take incredible bravery to face the townspeople after what she had put them through. But he could see that it was important to her. I'll be there with you, he promised. Whatever happens, you won't face it alone. Maria smiled, and this time the sadness in her eyes was mixed with something Jake hadn't seen there before. Hope. Thank you, Jake Morrison, she said. For everything. As they prepared to leave the cabin for the last time, Maria took one final look around the place where her family had tried to build a bridge between two worlds. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new possibilities, but tonight she was no longer alone. The morning sun cast long shadows across the main street of Cedar Ridge as Jake and Maria rode into town together. Maria sat straight in her saddle, wearing simple ranch clothes instead of Apache warrior garb. Her long dark hair was braided down her back and her face was clean of war paint. In her hands she carried the wooden mask that had hidden her identity for so long. Jake rode beside her, ready to support her through whatever came next. He could see the tension in her shoulders, but also the determination in her eyes. This was her choice, and he respected her courage in making it. People began to notice them as they made their way down the street. At first there were just curious glances. Two riders coming into town wasn't unusual. But as word spread that one of the riders was carrying something that looked like an Apache mask, windows began to open and people started to gather. Maria stopped her horse in front of Murphy's General Store and dismounted. Jake followed her lead, staying close but letting her take the initiative. This was her moment and her story to tell. Tom Murphy came out of his store, wiping his hands on his apron. His eyes went wide when he saw the mask in Maria's hands. "Is that?" he began, but his voice trailed off as he studied Maria's face. "Yes," Maria said clearly, her voice carrying across the growing crowd. "I am the person who has been appearing in your town as an Apache fighter. My name is Maria Reyes." A murmur ran through the crowd of townspeople who had gathered. Jake could see a mixture of emotions on their faces: surprise, confusion, and in some cases, anger. "You're a woman," said Mrs. Henderson from the boarding house, her voice filled with disbelief. "I am," Maria replied calmly, "and I'm also half Apache. My father was of the Chiricahua people, and my mother was a white school teacher. I was raised to understand both cultures, and I've spent the last 3 years trying to remind people of what this land meant before we all arrived." Sheriff Daniels pushed through the crowd, his hand resting on his gun. Jake tensed, ready to intervene if necessary, but Maria remained calm. "You've been breaking the law," the sheriff said, "disturbing the peace, threatening citizen." "I never threatened anyone," Maria said firmly. "I never hurt anyone. I simply appeared and reminded people that they are living on land that has a history they've chosen to forget." "But why?" asked Tom Murphy. "Why scare people? Why not just talk to us?" Maria's expression grew sad. "Because when a half-breed woman tries to talk about Apache history and sacred places, no one listens. But when a mysterious Apache fighter appears, suddenly everyone pays attention." Jake watched the faces in the crowd as they processed this information. He could see that some people were beginning to understand what Maria had been trying to do. "I came here this morning to apologize for frightening your children and disrupting your lives," Maria continued. "That was never my intention. I only wanted people to remember that this land has stories, and those stories matter." An older man named Carl Weber stepped forward from the crowd. Jake knew him as one of the original settlers in the area, someone who had been ranching here for over 20 years. "I remember your family," Weber said slowly. "Your parents had that trading post outside Phoenix. Your father was a good man, honest in his dealings and fair with everyone, Indian and white alike." Maria nodded, tears beginning to form in her eyes. "He taught me to love this land and to respect all the people who have called it home." "What happened to your folks?" Weber asked gently. Maria told her story to the assembled crowd: the forced relocations, her mother's death, her father's exile to the reservation, and her own isolation between two worlds that wouldn't fully accept her. As she spoke, Jake could see the anger in people's faces beginning to soften into sympathy and understanding. When she finished, the street was quiet except for the sound of wind rustling through the buildings. Finally, Tom Murphy spoke up. "I'm sorry for what happened to your family," he said, "and I'm sorry we never listened when you tried to tell us these things before." Other voices joined in, offering condolences and expressing regret for the way Maria had been treated. Jake felt proud of these people for being willing to listen and learn. Sheriff Daniels stepped forward again, but this time his hand was away from his weapon. "Technically, you did break some laws," he said. "But given the circumstances and the fact that no one was actually hurt, I'm willing to let this go if you promise to find a more peaceful way to make your point in the future." Maria nodded gratefully. "I promise. In fact, I'm leaving Cedar Ridge today to start a new life." Jake stepped forward and put his hand gently on Maria's shoulder. "Miss Reyes has agreed to come work on my ranch," he announced to the crowd. "She knows more about caring for this land than anyone I've ever met." Several people nodded approvingly. Carl Weber walked over and shook Maria's hand. "If you ever need anything, you know where to find me," he said. "Your father helped me out more than once when I was getting started here." As the crowd began to disperse, Maria carefully placed the wooden mask in her saddlebags. Jake could see that a weight had been lifted from her shoulders. She had told her truth and been heard, and that seemed to be enough. Tom Murphy approached them as they prepared to leave. "Miss Reyes," he said, "if you ever want to come back and tell us more stories about the Apache families who used to live here, we'd be honored to listen." Maria smiled, the first truly happy expression Jake had seen from her since their reunion. "I'd like that very much," she said. As they rode out of Cedar Ridge together, Jake looked over at Maria. "How do you feel?" he asked. "Free," she said simply. "For the first time in 3 years, I feel free." They rode north toward Jake's ranch through country that had been home to Apache families for generations and was now becoming home to settlers and ranchers. But instead of seeing it as a conflict between two ways of life, Jake began to imagine a future where the wisdom of both cultures could work together to care for the land they all loved. Maria rode beside him, no longer hidden behind a mask, ready to help build that future. The masked Apache fighter was gone forever, but Maria Reyes was finally home.